And over to you, Matthew.
Thank you. I'm just consenting to be recorded. Oops, and in consenting, we lost the presentation. Okay. Good evening, good morning, good day. Today, I'm going to tell you about our UAV, UAS, unmanned air system project that we're working on for New Zealand Red Cross. I'm going to begin with a fairly comprehensive introduction regarding my experience, because I suspect that I have made one or two decisions that other people would make differently. And I just wanted to emphasize that they're grounded on experience. Then I'll just look briefly at the problem of gathering field assessment data, which you wouldn't be attending this meeting if you weren't very familiar with that. So we don't have to spend very long on it. And then the advantages of UAVs and what I'm looking for in a UAV to satisfy that. I'll look at the airframe that we've chosen, and then the issue of taking pictures is easy, analyzing pictures is easy, but getting data to the analysts is not easy in a remote context. And all that I am saying this evening is built around the fact that our backyard is the Pacific with the Pacific Islands, and therefore the context in which we operate is that much harder than most other disaster responses. Maybe not harder, but certainly different. And then I'll just have a look at what plans we have for the future to do things even better. This is an unfamiliar medium, so probably best to save the questions to the end, which is a bit of a shame, because I like questions, they keep me alert, and it stops me delivering a lecture. However, you will get a lecture, but please do save up your questions and ask them at the end. And that will then show that what I've said is interesting, or indeed absolutely terrible, but you can then educate me by pulling apart what I've put in front of you. Ignore the hidden agenda bit. So, who am I? Very nearly half a century ago, I was an officer in the Royal Navy, and therefore I learned to drive ships and navigate ships. But I quickly subspecialized in aviation. Anti-submarine warfare observer in helicopters and aircraft captain. And essentially what I'm saying is that I was a professional aviator in a fairly hostile environment. However, I also learned to be a remote pilot for target drones. And if we look now, there we go, that's where I used to work. That's the observer's office. And from there, I drove my own aircraft with my voice. I drove other aircraft with my voice. I drove ships with my voice. And for recreation, we did things like search and rescue. And this chap has just been in the news, having popped up nearly into space and back again. My first search and rescue mission was Richard Branson's balloon crashing in the Irish Sea. And I'm in the helicopter, you can see there. I can say that with confidence because there were only 2 helicopters like that. And we discovered after the event that the camera we had on board had no film in it. So if there's a picture of a helicopter, it must be mine. Targets. This is me looking terribly military in front of what are frankly model aeroplanes, and therefore my credibility is in doubt. So this is the other target that I used to fly remotely. Sorry, that was a bit quick. But it's not going to come back, never mind. That looked a bit like a cruise missile. It got airborne 0 to 460 knots in 1.1 seconds. And it was used to simulate anti-ship missiles. Second career, I've seemed to have become an expert in the field of catastrophe communications. I did field communications for the Department of Conservation, who manage 30% of the New Zealand landmass. And for 10 years, I was employed by New Zealand Red Cross as the manager of disaster telecommunications and international disaster response capability. And Andrew Bate, whose name you'll see attending this meeting, has stepped in after me. So I have a master's degree in communications. I created an ERU, which you know about, and I also designed several disaster-proof communications tools, excuse me, for use in the Pacific Islands, radio, satellite, and cell phone. So that's why I think I have good ideas in this field. I included this slide mostly to make you smile. I hope I succeeded. No alpacas were hurt in the making of this image. The boxes are actually empty. So what are we trying to do? There's been a disaster. We know there's a problem, but we don't know how big it is and who needs what. Traditionally, we go door to door, and not so long ago, it was done with paper, and getting the paper back in the Pacific could take days, and then you still got to get it from paper into soft copy. And frankly, by the time that was done, if it was done, it was no longer relevant. We speeded that up by using tablets and phones and apps, which is great. It's straight in soft copy, but you're still constrained by your communications medium. So if there isn't cellular working, or you can't get back to HQ and get onto Wi-Fi, you still got a problem taking that data in. We'll skip over this. This is a solution to that using data or text over satellite. For what it's worth, as the data comes in, you can display it straight away. Also display as heat maps. And we're working on a very lean GIS. However, that's not relevant to what we're talking about today. So aerial reconnaissance and why we would pick unmanned air vehicles over manned aircraft. Firstly, I like the fact that UAVs are systematic, that rather than pointing the camera at what looks interesting, you actually systematically capture images of the whole village, which makes it statistically more significant. The other major issue is cost, and particularly from or in the Pacific, New Zealand will send a maritime patrol aircraft, and you're looking at $100,000 an hour, and it's 4 hours before they get to the disaster site, another 4 hours back, and that's a lot of money. Most people won't use a maritime patrol aircraft, and they might even use a light aircraft, but even then you're still at hundreds of dollars an hour, and you've got to have an airfield that has been cleared following the disaster and approved for use. And in the case of islands, basically, if it's on the island, it's part of the disaster. And if it's not on the island, it's a long way away for a small aircraft. So what am I looking for in a UAV? First and foremost, I went straight for fixed wing aircraft, not multi-rotor, which I think is one decision where a lot of those listening might have made a different decision. But with fixed wing, you get much more payload, and that can either be endurance or it can be cameras or multi-spectral photography, whatever. We needed something that was powered by electricity because liquid fuels, especially for model engines, are a logistics problem. Camera for creating a photomosaic for systematic analysis, and hand launch. So you can have bigger UAVs, but then you either need a catapult or you need some kind of runway to take off from. Hand launch is much simpler to get all your tools from A to B. And autonomous flight, in other words, join the dots navigation. And as the law allows, beyond visual line of sight, which is very important because it will allow us to operate from the edge of the disaster zone, not the middle of the disaster zone, and fly as many as 25 kilometers to the area of interest, have an hour on task, and 25 kilometers back. And particularly for us, the ability to land in the sea so that we can actually get a 6-meter open boat, banana boat, and take it out to an island and operate from the boat. So we don't need an airfield or a meadow or whatever. And if we can operate from a boat, we can operate from a beach, we can operate from a field, we can operate from anywhere. So here's what we selected. It's a commercial off-the-shelf airframe. Made of expanded polystyrene, which means that if it hits you on the head, it doesn't do a whole lot of damage. And that's the white bits. But Aeromaio have actually improved it in parts with the red bits. So you can see dark marks on the aircraft. Those are actually 3D printed components, which make for better attachment to the tailplane and things like that. It's got its own built-in parachute. So in the event of loss of control, you can hit people gently on the head instead of fiercely on the head, and a camera sitting in the belly. And frankly, it wasn't as expensive as many unmanned air vehicles are. If you want to check out Aeromaio, that's a website. So that's what we've developed to date. But we want to improve on simply flying and taking pictures. And in the very near future, we're looking at machine learning. And if you have questions for me about machine learning, I will probably ask Vince to step in and answer most of them. Thank you, Vince. And a little bit further in the future, we would like an autonomous capability whereby the aircraft can operate by itself over several days. And I'll talk about that a bit later on. So we can collect data, but the truth is we don't make decisions on pictures. We make decisions on spreadsheets. And to turn pictures into spreadsheets, you use image analysts or virtual volunteers. The problem is that having them in the front line is expensive, that you're looking at gigabytes of data and you need a lot of bodies to look at a lot of images. But equally, transmitting gigabytes by satellite is an expensive prospect, and we really don't want to do that if we can help it. So what we're working on is training machine learning to do the analysis. So before we transmit the data, it's become, instead of gigabytes of images, kilobytes of spreadsheet, which is a substantially cheaper option for satellite data. So we collect the images and ask the computer to take a look, and it looks at and works out what it thinks are buildings. And we then ask it, and a future stretch goal is actually to work out outlines of flood and landslip as well. But From number of dwellings, number of buildings, we can estimate number of dwellings. From number of dwellings, we can estimate population based on census data and average number of people per house. And we can look at roof damage and assess shelter needs in a fairly crude triage. But essentially, if the roof is undamaged, that household doesn't need shelter. If the roof shows some damage, shelter could be provided by giving tarpaulin and tools to patch the roof. And if they don't fit within that category, then they need alternative accommodation. And we know, therefore, from the machine learning, how many people we're dealing with, how many people we need to feed, and how many people we need to accommodate. Just as an aside, you don't necessarily need a high-spec computer, very high-spec computer, to do your analysis, in that neural networks can now be plugged into USB ports. So I'm actually quite comfortable that even if we're working this year at a compute power that exceeds what's readily available in a laptop to take to the front line, thanks to the fact that Moore's law refuses to die, in a year or two, we will have computers that will do that, even if we can't do it this year. So looking a bit further in the future, multi-day autonomous operations, what's just flown in is something that's created by Sherbrooke University in Canada. And I liked what they were doing and went and had a look and said hello to them. And you can see that it's covered in solar panels. What you can't see from this image is that the engine tilts so it can do a vertical takeoff. But what you're not carrying is redundant lift motors, which the majority of vertical takeoff UAVs seem to have. So, they take off with 4 lift motors, which only supply drag and weight for the rest of the sortie. It's covered in solar panels, so when it lands in the sea, it can refuel by sunbathing. And that in turn means that you can look at multi-day missions. So they can fly for a couple of hours, sunbathe for 4 hours, fly for a couple more hours. And that, of course, also means that any machine learning and image processing will start to have to be done on board rather than taking an SD card out of the camera and processing it at your forward operating base. But with the multi-day mission, quite literally, what I would like to be able to do is open the office window and toss out the UAV, and it will puddle jump its way to the area of operations. So we don't have to transport people into harm's way. The aircraft takes itself and can do visit several sites on its mission. This is that UAV in action, admittedly on a mill pool calm lake in Quebec. But nonetheless, I find it very impressive to watch. But having said that, it only does the same thing. But if you want to chase up the reference I took that from, you'll see that it was an IEEE website at the bottom of that image. Ignore that. This is a presentation I did a while back for the Royal Aeronautical Society, so we can skip over that. This is worth saying, though. I think flying UAVs nowadays is remarkably easy as a skill, certainly compared to what I had to do without autopilot. And I think the real problem is going to be overcoming prejudice from professional aviators who don't want us in the same airspace as themselves. So within our group, we must have a culture of safety and professionalism, and we must communicate that culture to the people we will be operating with. And to that end, it's my goal to begin with professional aviators and also invest quite a lot of time preemptively visiting the places that we might deploy to, the Pacific Island countries, and introduce ourselves and how we would like to operate, and generally set their minds at ease while it's not a disaster, so that they're not having to grasp new ideas and new ways of working at a time when they're maxed out by a crisis. And it's my goal that we should have permission to deploy, preemptive permission to deploy when disaster strikes, which is not to say that we operate without permission, but it does mean that we can set off without being invited and then say, okay, we've arrived. How should we work? Where do you want us to go? So we've got the airframes. Thanks to COVID, everything else at the moment is marking time. But the goal is that when we can do it ourselves in New Zealand, actually to devolve the capability to Pacific Island Red Cross societies. So when we've learned how to do it, we can teach other people to do it. We can maintain a central point of training and standards so that all the national societies are doing the same thing in the same way, which means they can prop across borders and help each other. And we can also supply surge capacity so that they can be in there with minimal time late, and we can turn up with more people and more equipment to support what they're doing. Budgets, of course, vary with management whims, and currently COVID is restricting fundraising, which in turn restricts spending money. And social distancing was a block on training. And even though we're lucky enough to be without social distancing within this country, traveling anywhere else at the moment is not practical either. So at the moment, we're marking time before actually launching this ship. There we go. Questions, please.
Lorenzo, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Matthew. I was really following your presentation. Just a couple of questions for similar activities that have been done in the past, and it might be interesting to understand how you solved or overcome a couple of issues. So in Central Mediterranean Sea, I'm talking about 2016, 2017, MOAS as an NGO operated a Shibel camcopter for a search and rescue operation, using it as an unmanned maritime patrol aircraft. At the same time, there was a couple of European military operations at sea, flying maritime patrol aircrafts and helicopters, both for search and rescue and medevac operations. So at that time, we had established an air traffic control aboard UNAVFOR Med headquarters in order to ensure flight path segregation and increase flight security and flight safety. How do you envisage to do something like that during assessment operation, or just how did you do that when you flight your UAVs in the different scenarios that you showed up?
Now, I've got to confess that we are not yet operational. However, the way we'll approach it is to ask each country how they want to work. The simple answer would be to create a danger area in our area of operations, and that buys the airspace for us. However, that, while simple, doesn't allow other aircraft to operate. So time division is another very successful way of doing it, that particularly if we are operating close to our targets, we could operate for a couple of hours after dawn, and fixed-wing aircraft would only be arriving at about 10 a.m. anyway, by the time they wait for the sun to get up and do their aircraft checks and brief their crews and whatever. So providing all parties know who is doing what, where, and at what time, deconfliction is not an issue. But this comes back to the professionalism, and we really must make sure that we communicate and are integrated with the big boys. And it is my real fear that enthusiasts with UAVs will step in and scare people.
Thanks. And that comes my second question. Thanks a lot, Matthew. Considering we are dealing with our civil aviation authority for flying drones and so on, but still, what I'm saying is that we work a lot together with the CAA, but the law and regulation environment is quite strong. So and I'm seeing that in different countries there are different regulations and also different licenses. It's not exactly aligned to what is now available for pilots, for manned aircraft pilots. So have you found ways in how to overcome that or how to support that, even maybe through international disaster response law or other regulatory systems?
We're actually extremely lucky in the Pacific in that civil aviation of Pacific Islands take their lead from New Zealand. So their regulation is a very close copy of ours. But we're also lucky in New Zealand that the Civil Aviation Authority are quite pro UAV, that they know it's inescapable. So they're actually trying to find ways of working together as opposed to prohibition. And we're a small enough country that if we ask to be heard, they will listen. So we can actually be part of the creation of those regulations. And I'm lucky that I have a volunteer assisting me who used to be a CAA employee and is now a consultant in the field of independent aircraft. So he speaks their language and he knows the people. That solves the problem for the Pacific. But if we wish to go further afield, then essentially we simply got to go to the CAA and find how we can work together. I don't see us having a one solution globally, much as that would be good or easy. The problem being that in a disaster, everyone is extremely stressed, and stressed people have tunnel vision. They are not capable of creative thought or absorbing new ideas, which is why I want to invest a lot of time preemptively visiting the countries we think we're going to visit, so that we've done that investment first. I suspect I'm not giving you the answer you want, but I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot, Matthew. Thanks a lot.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat, 4 or 5 of them. If you could share a little bit more information on the machine learning component.
I would like to volunteer Vince to answer that.
Thanks for that. I can talk about it, or if you want to give me your email address, I can share stuff by email. I'm not quite sure if this is something of general interest or just for one person. What I'll do is I'll just give a little bit of an overview of what we're doing. It's early days because, well, I'll explain that in a minute as well, but the goal that I'm working with, that Matthew has kindly asked to have, is ultimately to try and have, as you probably saw in his presentation as well, ultimately is to have the compute power in the UAV and sending, doing the analysis on it as it's flying across, taking photos, and send the data back to the central, to the DR center. I see the person in question has shared their email address, so that's good. And what we're doing at the moment is, one of the biggest problems is obtaining data. So we need UAV footage of areas that have had disasters with suitable, well, I say suitable buildings, images of buildings and things that have got various states of damage. And the first stage of that is going through and manually annotating the images so that you can train the neural network model, the models that we're trying to use. And once you get past that, we would initially consider deploying it on a laptop and collecting the images by returning memory sticks to a central location. And then somewhere in the future, we would aim to get some hardware that can be used on the UAV. It's early days yet because we've only just acquired some images that we can look at labeling and annotating for training it, and I've done a few little tests with some models just to prove to myself at the very least that it's at least somewhat technically feasible, and also some of the literature that I've read also suggests that it should be feasible. The thing that it won't give is 100% accurate answers, but as Matthew points out to me, we're not after that. We're after enough information to guide people on the ground as to where to deploy the resources. So it looks like a feasible project at this stage, but we'll see. So I've got a few email addresses that have been shared here in the comments, and I'll send a bit more information that I can in some emails to these guys.
If I could just add to what Vince said, we've been lucky to acquire UAV images taken following a cyclone in Tonga. So that's right in our area of operations and exactly the material that we are looking to analyze, which is a blessing, because as I understand it, machine learning, ultimately, it's a black box. We don't know really how it does it, but when you train it, it starts giving you reproducible and useful answers. But it means that if you train it in Tonga and then you take it to Haiti, it may not actually work without fresh training, because the roofs are a different color, or there is more thatch and less steel used in the roof. So the training material needs to be quite close to where you expect to operate.
Thank you. How are the operations financed? Is it through internal funds or donor-funded projects?
We're not at the stage of being operational, so that's easy. Right now, it's internal funds. But when there's a disaster, money is less of an issue. It's usually spending money in advance of disasters is the hard bit. So I actually don't anticipate a problem having money for operations, but maybe we're just lucky in that respect.
Could you,
and
sorry.
it occurs to me, Andrew Bate could give a better answer to that.
Thank you, Matthew. New Zealand Red Cross, or at least this team that I lead, is actually financed partly by funding from the generous donors of New Zealanders, but also being part of the international team, we have a generous funding program through the New Zealand government, which is a part of the international commitments to providing a proportion of our GDP to humanitarian work. So we have a 5-year contract with the New Zealand government, and the program that this sits under is called Knowledge Pacific, which is aimed at improving the ability of national societies in the Pacific to make better decisions using data, and obviously the UAV and the machine learning fits underneath that. So we have a 5-year program of funding with New Zealand government, plus the funding that we get through the generosity of New Zealanders.
Great, thank you. 2 more questions and about 12 minutes left on the hour. Could you please describe what initial capabilities New Zealand Red Cross expects to have operational to respond to emergencies on day 1 after you become operational? For example, the number of drones or drone teams, geographic reach which you are aiming for, etc. When are you planning for that, or is COVID uncertainty the problem right now?
Well, COVID uncertainty is certainly a problem, but I think we could be operational 2 years from now. And that's partly professional qualification of the team, and it's partly certifying the organization as a professional operator of drones that will allow us to do things that the amateur is not allowed to do. Essentially, it's my goal to use the same model as we use for the ERU, which is 10 trained people for each deployed person. I see a deployment team as being 3 people, team leader to interface between the team and the country, and save the team from being asked questions when they're busy. Aviation specialists to actually make the airframe fly safely and navigate where it's meant to, and a data specialist to make sure that we gather the data required and analyze it in the manner possible. But all will have a common training so that they can fill in for each other if one gets diarrhea and is not available for that day or whatever. So it's our experience that in order to get one team away at very short notice, you need 10 people trained. But that actually means we can then follow up with more teams slightly slower, in that they're trained and ready to go. Currently, we have hardware for 1 deployment, but that is easily solved by buying more hardware when we've proven that we're able to do these things. And I think it's quite probable that we will leave the hardware with the National Society if they show an aptitude and a willingness to pick up the skills, and then take some of their people in for a training program, the same as we put our people through, so that they can then use the tool. And I think it might have a genuine use in fundraising between disasters, in that aerial photography is a useful skill. In terms of geographic reach, initially the islands of the Pacific, but genuinely, I think a drone ERU is a sensible and realistic option and we should be capable of a global deployment. Does that answer your question?
Brent, is that?
Sorry, yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And we have one more question, but also I should have, after reading the questions and having them answered, seen if for the other ones, if there's any follow-up or if the question was answered fully. So if anybody who's had a question from the chat read out wants to add a follow-up, or you feel free to do so. And Paul is interested in hearing success stories on how flight authorizations and permits are swiftly secured, and whether there's any security risk associated with managing the flights in the field.
Well, firstly, for Paul, I would say that for all the rules and regulations, it's actually person-to-person contact which makes things possible. So the best thing you can do is to get to know the people in the Civil Aviation Authority who give authorizations and find out what they don't like about UAVs and set their fears at rest and build their confidence. And ultimately, it comes down to trust. And if they don't trust you or simply don't know you, the answer will be no. But if you invest time in building trust, they're much more likely to give approval. On the second point, I need to ask you, what do you mean by security risk? Do you mean hitting other aircraft or people with AK-47s attacking you on the ground?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Paul.
Yes, I mean, when you are doing the flights, there's normally a fear that it could be used as a surveillance tool, and probably it can be targeted. That's the fear. And I know you are focusing more on natural disasters like floods and all that. How does it work in a conflict area where people get displaced? Thank you.
That is a very big and difficult question. And I would actually suggest that in a conflict zone, it is probably not at all wise to fly UAVs. If you do feel that it's essential, then you must invest an enormous amount of time in making sure that all the people underneath know what you are planning to do, why you plan to do it, and trust you to do it. Because if there is fear and suspicion, I think you will rapidly become a target. I think the drone itself is very safe. I used to fly model aeroplanes as targets for machine guns, and they rarely, if ever, could hit it. And I was flying directly towards them with the intention of providing a target. But in terms of your physical security, when people know where you're operating from, that is a considerable problem. If you feel you must do it, then I think you must take steps to conceal where you're operating. And for example, fly below the tree line until such time as your aircraft is well distant from where you launched.
Does that answer your question, Paul?
Yes, please. Very useful.
Great. I think we'd have time for one more question if there's one. There's a comment, even in natural disasters, coordination with military aircraft is our critical issue. So we are planning to conduct the coalition avoidance system with National Institute.
Yeah, these are things that really must be addressed in advance, and everyone has to know exactly what they're doing. And by that, I mean a positive control, that there is a statement of who is operating in what area at what time. For aircraft safety, there cannot be uncertainty or ambiguity about who has permission to do what, where, at what time.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for joining.